I oppose the nomination of Robert Bork to the Supreme Court, and I urge the Senate to reject it. In the Watergate scandal of 1973, two distinguished Republicans, Attorney General Elliot Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus, put integrity and the Constitution ahead of loyalty to a corrupt president. They refused to do Richard Nixon's dirty work, and they refused to obey his order to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. The deed devolved on Solicitor General Robert Bork, who executed the unconscionable assignment that has become one of the darkest chapters for the rule of law in American history. That act, later ruled illegal by a federal court, is sufficient by itself to disqualify Mr. Bork from this new position to which he has been nominated. The man who fired Archibald Cox does not deserve to sit on the Supreme Court of the United States.
That was Senator Ted Kennedy in 1987 when he rushed to the Senate floor to make that speech less than an hour after hearing that Republican President Ronald Reagan nominated Robert Bork to the Supreme Court. A new book explains the Kennedy strategy in opposing the nomination before hearing a single word from the nominee in the Senate confirmation hearing. Quote, he was pulling a fire alarm for the left. He was rousing the liberal base, announcing that this was a fight worth making to which Ted Kennedy would devote his name and talents and organizing skills. He was acting quickly before wary, moderate Republicans and Democrats could announce their approval of the nomination. If you didn't follow the nomination battle closely, you had a right to think, as I did in those days, that it was all about blocking the man who had done the legal dirty work for the criminal Republican president, Richard Nixon, who obtained a pardon after he resigned the presidency. But the fight was about much more than that. It was a fight against Robert Bork's America.
Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, and school children could not be taught about evolution. Writers and artists would be censured at the whim of government.
In Robert Bork's confirmation hearing, Senator Kennedy exposed Robert Bork as someone who did not believe in a right to privacy, including privacy behind a closed bedroom door.
Well, let me repeat about this created, generalized, and undefined right of privacy in Griswold. If it really is a right of sexual freedom in private, as some people have suggested, then Bowers against Hardwick, which upheld a statute against sodomy as applied to homosexuals, is wrongly decided.
Robert Bork made it very clear he did not believe gay people had a right to sexual privacy, but he actually didn't believe anyone had a right to sexual privacy. Thanks to Ted Kennedy rushing to the Senate floor and making the opposition argument within an hour of the nomination, Robert Bork's confirmation was defeated on the Senate floor, 58-42. The Reagan White House then sent up the nomination of Anthony Kennedy, who was confirmed to fill the empty seat on the Supreme Court and who became a Republican supporter of Roe versus Wade on the Supreme Court. He bought us 25 years, said one activist about Ted Kennedy's defeating the Bork nomination. Ted Kennedy did not live to see us forced into a version of Robert Bork's America by the current Supreme Court. When Justice Samuel Alito wrote the Supreme Court opinion overturning Roe versus Wade, he also, in effect, overturned what he told Senator Kennedy in a private meeting before his Senate confirmation hearing. I am a believer in precedents, Judge Alito said in a recollection the senator recorded and had transcribed in his diary. People would find I adhere to that. Our next guest, John Farrell, had access to Senator Kennedy's diary for his new biography of Ted Kennedy. And in a New York Times article published today, John Farrell reveals Ted Kennedy's private account of what Justice Alito told him. I believe that there is a right to privacy. I think it's settled as part of the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. Mr. Kennedy quoted Judge Alito as saying. Mr. Kennedy continued with this recollection of Judge Alito's words. So I recognize there is a right to privacy. I'm a believer in precedents. I think on the Roe case, that's about as far as I can go. And joining us now is author and historian and biographer John Aloysius Farrell. His latest book, Ted Kennedy, A Life, is on sale tomorrow at your local bookstore and online. Jack Farrell, thank you very much for being here. I'm officially on record already as saying I love this book. It's right there on the back of the book.
And I will mow your lawn for the next 3 summers.
And we see so much in what Ted Kennedy was fighting against coming to fruition now. I mean, that Bork moment was about the fight that the Supreme Court the Democrats are having with the Supreme Court right now.
And it's not just abortion, it's also voting rights. Mm-hmm. Ted Kennedy reached across the aisle, worked with Bob Dole and Ronald Reagan, and passed a 25-year extension of the Voting Rights Act. And then the Supreme Court dismantled it. And campaign finance. Ted Kennedy reached across the aisle with Hugh Scott and passed a campaign finance law that the New York Times on the front page said was going to end the influence of wealthy special interests in American politics forever. And that, too, has been dismantled with a series of cases over the years. So I guess the one lesson is that you have to be eternally vigilant, that you have to fight these fights over and over again. And if there is a critique of the left in the book, it's that the left has sort of fallen a little bit asleep.
The Kennedy Senate career has wins, it has losses, it has a lot of losses, has a lot of setbacks. And also, he never loses an election, but his party does. Right? I mean, in a Senate election, he did lose his campaign for the presidency, lost the nomination. So what does his life in the Senate tell us about these reversals on things like midterm elections and legislative reversals?
One thing is that there's never a huge total victory. Karl Rove once told me, when the Democrats were really down in the dumps, that you can never count out one of America's majority parties. And he was talking about the Democrats, his foes. And sure enough, 4 years later, they came back and elected Barack Obama. So that's one issue. You have to keep the long game in mind at all times. The other thing I think is that the Democratic Party has always been such a hodgepodge of interests that sometimes it doesn't know what it is, what it stands for, or finds it hard to stand for something.
What would he say about the era we're in now? Would it be even imaginable to him that there could have been a Donald Trump presidency?
He hated it. He hated it when Gingrich came to Congress and won the speakership and began sending those acolytes over to the Senate. And it changed what had been a cooperative, superior body into a snake pit like the House of Representatives. And it was not Ted Kennedy's happiest time in office, but he persevered. He fought for immigration reform when nobody else wanted to do it. He got people like McCain, Lindsey Graham, Sam Brown back on his side. But that it was the onset of Rush Limbaugh and Fox News, and they whipped up the base against them foreigners. The first anti-immigration effort by the far right, and he was defeated. But he was ready to come back again. He was going to do it again. He was biding his time, and he was going to come back again.
Now, you covered him as a Boston Globe reporter while he was in the Senate. I think people like you and I had a right to think there's nothing new to learn about Ted Kennedy at this point in the 21st century. But I've learned a lot of new material in this book about Ted Kennedy. What surprised you the most?
First of all, very gratifying. But most of all,
the access to the diaries no one's ever had.
No. But one thing is that I write the book also. I write these books also. My last book was about Richard Nixon for the next generation, because for them, these people are caricatures. They're not people. They didn't live through it and see that there were good days and bad days. They just, they know of them as either like superheroes or supervillains. So that's one thing. The diaries, it was pluck and luck, as all investigative reporting is. I knew they were out there. I began to find traces of them. What happened was, even though he wanted to keep them secret, he would have his staff use them for briefing papers or speeches. And very often they would, rather than send them back to the bowels of the Kennedy Library, they would stick them in a folder, and I could find them 20, 40 years later.